everybody, and welcome to Fraudible, the official podcast of the International Society of Economic Criminology. Fraudible is the video podcast that brings together academics and practitioners and to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're going to be discussing fraud and language. So who else would I have join me today than academic and Dr. Elisabeth Carter and practitioner Alex Wood. Hi guys, thanks for joining me. Hi. Hello. Liz, could you please start by giving us a brief introduction into you and your work, please?
Of course. I'm Dr. Elisabeth Carter. I'm a criminologist and a forensic linguist. I look at the ways in which criminals use language to persuade their victims to perform acts that they never would otherwise. More than that, it's not just about plain persuasion. It's about using the language to make victims feel as though they're in a safe situation and that the decisions they're making are their own and not the decisions of the criminal who's there to take their money from them.
Thank you very much. Alex, a brief introduction from you, please.
Yeah, so that was great, Liz. I'm Alex Wood. Most people will know that I'm a sort of former prolific or hyper-prolific financial offender. I now advise government and banks and sort of large global financial institutions about detection and prevention, so as to try to stop people like I used to be.
Thank you very much. So, Alex, can you tell me about how language played a really vital role in the crimes that you used to perpetrate?
Yeah, so I've always, I think I've always been fascinated about the idea that there are patterns of words that you can say, orders of words that you can say, and if you say those words in that order with a certain inflection and a certain accent and at a certain rate, you can then convince people at the end of saying those words to send you all the money they have in the world, whether that's a business, whether that's a victim of a romance scam. And that's fascinating me, the ability of just manipulating language in that way in order to receive that money that you're not entitled to. I'm also equally fascinated about, for example, very successful salespeople that will start work each day and think to themselves, if I say words today in a certain order, in a certain way, with a certain inflection and at a certain rate, I could make a huge amount of money. For me, I think as a sort of bad actor, that meant language was my nuclear bomb. It's fascinating, and so much financial crime is predicated on words being delivered in that way, and it can be so powerful as we're going to get into. So yeah, that's my fascination with linguistics and financial crime.
Liz, what sort of work have you done that sort of shows what Alex is saying in practice can have the impact that it does?
There's quite a bit of work in this area. Some of it is mine, and it absolutely reflects what Alex has lived experience of, which is why your experiences are so valuable, Alex, because you put the meat on the bones in terms of this is what happens in practice. The type of research that I've been doing is looking at precisely that, the types of words, the way that they're said, and the impact that has on the recipient. Now, using a method called conversation analysis, you're able to, with audio interactions, break down and transcribe in great detail what is said, the way it's said, the intonation up and downs, the pauses, everything, as well as the content itself. And then you can see in what's called the next turn proof procedure, you can see how the recipient has interpreted that and the impact of the words and the phrasings. Even down to when you pause, you will then invite a response from the other person, but you won't, explicitly say, I want you to talk now. You will invite that person interactionally to fill that gap. Now, those kinds of things, precisely as Alex said, can be used in legitimate contexts like sales, and that kind of persuasive language, but then it's absolute gold for individuals who will use it for criminal intent. Just one brief example about words. So I said a little bit about extra interactional stuff, so the pauses, but with words, if you say just, you actually minimize what it is. Oh, if I can just get your details now. It's a very quick thing, and it feels like it's part of a process. It won't ring any alarm bells.
Alex, how many times have you said just over the last 20 odd years?
Just a few, I think. I'm really interested in what Liz just said about pauses. I don't know if I'm guessing you have seen the film Boiler Room, both of you.
Yes, indeed.
And there's a famous part of that film where the sort of ringleader of was it Vin Diesel's character? He was coaching somebody how to deliver this very powerful, dishonest pitch. And then he stops the conversation with the victim and he said, right, the next person to speak loses. And it was like that pause, somebody feels they need to fill it. And if the fraudster speaks next, he's lost the victim. But if the victim speaks next, they're screwed. And it's that pause. It's who breaks that pause, then loses everything.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I've done some work in much earlier in my career in looking at the language used in police interviews. And one of the tactics used in police interviews, either knowingly or unknowingly by police officers, is the pause. And you will get a lot more information from the person that you're interviewing, more details, because it's an information interview. But also it signals, I found with this is part of my PhD, but it signals some kind of dissatisfaction by the person who's pausing. So the information you've given is not enough, or not the right quality, or needs to be different. So you can actually, even in police interview settings, inadvertently coerce somebody into giving different information because it seemed that the original information isn't enough due to that pause. So even silence can be really dangerous.
Interesting. Okay.
They say silence is golden, but perhaps for a different reason here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, fair enough. And I think that also relays into the messaging efforts that you've done, Liz, in the past, because Alex, in some of your presentations that I've seen, you talk about how you've kind of done the opposite of what you'd expect. So, for example, you used to call people and say that if you think I am a fraudster, then hang up now. So you're almost using like a reverse psychology with them in that respect.
Yeah. So a lot of that was a conscious decision because there's a raft of sort of public protection messaging around the idea that fraudsters will try and rush you. So one of the key things about a successful fraud or traditionally successful fraud is the idea of creating urgency, a sense of urgency. So, for example, you've got 2 minutes to move your money to a safe account or you lose all of it. Or this investment offer is only available today. That sort of rush. So because of that intense public messaging, I decided to take the completely contrary approach and develop a very slow and consultative relationship with the victim. So in the case of the APP fraud, it would be the idea that a fraud has happened on their account, for example. We're the bank, we're investigating it. But that's an interesting point I think we'll come on to later is the idea of somebody committing fraud doesn't want to mention the word fraud. But there's a huge amount of successful fraud which is committed because you say you're from the police or you're from the bank's fraud team and you're trying to solve fraud on their account. So you're mentioning fraud. So the victim doesn't think you're committing fraud because why would a fraudster say fraud? Like that's the last thing they're going to say, okay? But yeah, so I used to develop a very slow and consultative approach just because that public messaging was out there that people are going to try and rush you. But there's a lot of language, I'm sure Liz will be able to express this much better than me, but a lot of language that is intended to create that sense of urgency. So, just as the word just makes it look legitimate, that there are certain sort of linguistic devices that one will use to make or to convey the impression of urgency.
Then I guess from that perspective, Liz, just and given what Alex has said, does that make creating messaging really difficult? Because if you have this sort of set idea in your mind of, okay, so fraudsters are going to ask me to rush, they're going to force me into making quick decisions, and then people like Alex come along who are like, hey, it's fine, and they don't necessarily rush you. Does that make your job of trying to create like effective messaging for the public all the more difficult?
It does. It just means we need to be agile and not stuck in case studies, because case studies are informative, but actually they don't protect the public. They tell the public about one particular type of fraud, the way it's committed, and how you can protect yourself from that. But that's not what fraud always looks like. It looks very different. And not only that, but we do find fraud criminals weaponizing people's attempts to protect themselves. So, why are you checking if I'm real? Don't you love me? Or, why are you questioning me? I'm from the police.
Yeah.
They weaponize it. But that mention of fraud as well is something that I found very often in romance fraud. The criminal themselves will make themselves look vulnerable by saying that they've been a victim of a fraud and they're a bit worried about online dating. So the elephant's is being named in the room, and this person is saying fraud, is saying scam, and then the victim now feels as though they need to tread really carefully around them because they don't want to do any harm to the criminal. They don't realise it's the criminal. So there's a few things going on there. With protection messaging, particularly around rushing and urgency, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Alex, because this is one thing that we can do something about. Most recent messages I've seen are, don't rush, take your time. Now, one of those things that happens when someone says don't rush, you are going to rush. And I liken this to if I was stood back there, and someone opened a door for me, I would rush to the door. I would make an outward display of I'm hurrying, because I'm not going to waste your time by sauntering along casually, because it's really rude. You are doing something for me, I would rush. But I don't feel like I'm rushed by you. I feel like I want to. That's the messaging we need to put out there. You may not feel like you were being told to rush, but you will feel that sense of urgency, and it might come from you or it might come from someone else. That's really key, because the person on the other end of the line or in front of you or, on your email might say, don't worry, you can hang up, you can do all those things. You feel you don't want to. You fully want to stay on the line. What I would say is you should hang up at that point and you should check, no matter how much you like the person on the line or you trust and believe them, particularly if you like, trust and believe the person. Because there's one more thing about fraud protection messaging is it always specifically says, if you're feeling concerned, you should hang up, you should check. The newsflash is that most victims of fraud do not feel concerned at the point at which they should hang up. They feel fine. So the protection should be, you should always hang up. You should never buy at the door. You should never, no matter what.
A lot of that sort of linguistic side of that also leads into the creation of trust through trying to persuade somebody that you're in a position of authority. So, fraudsters will say they're a bank member of staff or a police officer or from HMRC, or equally a legitimate, loving partner who wants to love this person, and romance fraud, for example, and is capable of having a loving relationship. So there's an authority, there's a genuine sort of character being built up. So I've committed all sorts of types of fraud, but I've successfully convinced people that I'm from the bank. I've successfully convinced people that I'm a duke, a member of the aristocracy, and it's all through linguistics and using language, using words to create that. Like pretending I was a duke, I'd use the sort of language that a duke might use. I'd speak like a duke might speak. If I wanted to sound like I was in the fraud centre of a bank, I use a completely different matrix of linguistics and talk like I was reading off a script, a little bit bored. I'm in my 20s and playing five-side football tonight. I don't really care if I help you or not, just doing my job, going at 5 o'clock on the dot, and just living that almost like method acting. I think a lot of romance scammers in particular, they try to become that person. They try to become that idea that they've created. They when I was pretending that I was in the fraud team of a bank, myself and my co-defendant would turn up every day at 9 o'clock to work in our office. We'd leave at 5. We'd have call centre music playing in the background to just create that buzz that somebody might be sitting in a bank call centre. So there's so much sort of background research that goes into it all. Is as Liz said on the BBC thing we did last year. I remember you saying fraud is pervasive, and I didn't quite grasp exactly what you meant when you said that. And I've really looked into what the idea of pervasive fraud is, and it's so deep and pervasive and compelling.
It really is. Was it 5 Ways They Get You?
It was, yeah, with Shari.
Oh, that was really good fun to do. I totally agree. And the thing is, to have to almost embody the characteristics of the person that you're playing, that does happen really often. And even if, the individuals who are part of a serious organised criminal gang or organisation that are committing romance fraud, the scripts will very much embody the type of language you'd expect, which is where we get to the whole idea of red flags and alarm bells, because everything's designed to feel congruent. You would expect, if someone from a call centre phoning you up, you would expect those call centre noises in the background. You wouldn't expect a baby crying and a dog barking. Okay. If it was the police phoning you up, you'd expect a certain tone of voice and a certain requests, that power. You'd expect that. So because everything is context dependent and there's nothing that jars against that, there's no reason why someone would want to or need to protect themselves. So my message is, for protection messaging, what I'm trying to build in is that you shouldn't just try and protect yourself if you feel like something's weird, because the best fraudsters, the best of what they do, don't want to give them any credit, are the ones that are going to not raise any alarm bells. Everything feels right and the decisions feel like they come from you, which is why then when you realise, however far down along the line, that you've become a victim of fraud, you blame yourself because you feel like you've made those decisions and you've had the opportunity to make those decisions. Alex, I remember that in some of your frauds, you gave your victims the chance to make decisions.
Yeah, exactly. One basic sort of foundation laying tool we used was to build up a pattern of yeses, and I know there's something you've talked about, like getting the victim to be used to saying yes to you, by asking them questions which are going to get a yes. I mean, this sounds like sort of Darren Brown stuff, right? But you had any suspicious emails recently? Well, we get them all the time, right? So yes. Have you any spam? Yes. Has your computer been buffering a bit? Has it been lagging? Yes. All the time, right? So these are things which you know, and if a victim can get used to saying yes to somebody, then when you ask them to do something bad, they're used to saying yes. They've not said no to you before, and it just adds that tiny, even if it's 1% barrier. I've not said no to this person yet, so therefore why should I don't know? The most powerful psychological device of making a victim feel empowered was giving them the opportunity to opt out of the phone call or the sort of engagement. So I'd used to research members of staff at the bank, for example, so by using LinkedIn, and get genuine names, so that if the person wanted to Google who this person was on the phone, I wouldn't push it down their throat. I just have it there in the background, and then they would Google that name and the name of the bank, and it would come up, and on LinkedIn it would say it's legit, and so on. We had one instance where a victim phoned the bank and said, I'm on the phone to Andy Peters, pluck the name out. Does he work on your fraud team? And the person at the bank said, he's our global head of fraud. And the victim said to this person at the bank, he's on the phone to me now, and is that okay? And the bank said, that's absolutely fine. He works for us. And that was like, for fraud, that was like a gift from heaven. It's incredible. But then the most powerful thing, I think, was giving the opportunity to the victim to hang up the phone and end the phone call by saying something like, we're going to have to do a series of test payments, or we're going to have to move money to a safe account. Despite knowing my name, despite seeing the phone number that we've spoofed that's on your screen, if you're not 100% sure that we're from the bank, because there are fraudsters out there, people are going to try and steal your money. We need you to trust me because I'm from the bank. So hang up now if you think that is concerning you, and because just by virtue of making that offer for the victim to end the call, putting them in power, or they think they're in power, in fact they had no power, but they thought they had power, and by them then deciding, well, this has to be legit, because no fraudster would ever give his mark the opportunity to hang up, because the public messaging says fraudsters will rush you, they'll be overbearing, and so on. I then absolutely can trust him. And from that point on, there's this very powerful sort of what I call a psychological pact to proceed, with the phone call, because the victim has chosen not to opt out.
Yeah, and then everything from then on is in your gift then.
It is.
Because to then turn around for the victim to then at some point later, 5 minutes or 10 minutes later in the call, to go, actually, I don't think this is real. It's almost impossible to imagine that situation where they would then say no, because they've already, like you say, there's that psychological pact. They've already agreed. So it would have to be something catastrophic on the criminal's end to happen for the victim to then think, oh, hang on, this isn't real.
Or maybe somebody else coming and talking to the victim and saying, do you know, you sure? Some of they know.
Absolutely.
Which rarely happen. But you can almost imagine how. Well, I mean, I'm sure you've had much more contact with victims, real life victims, than I ever have. But how much more the victim will blame themselves, having made that conscious decision, and how stupid they'll feel, having been given the opportunity to hang up and decided not to take it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in some frauds, that's built in. I think the types of frauds that you committed, that wasn't built in. I think the psychological harm and shame was just it was a side impact. But for some criminals and some fraud types, it's built in. So for romance fraud, it's built in, that psychological harm. So they will double guess themselves and they will stay in that relationship much longer. And when they realise they've been a victim of the crime, they are much less likely to report it because they blame themselves. They will keep it secret. All of these things play into the criminal's hands.
And that's, I guess, why I think fraud, we think that only 17% is reported.
Yeah.
So staggering 83%, almost like 5 in 6 is never reported.
Absolutely. And I think public awareness and protection messaging can go some way to alleviate that. It's about driving down that shame, showing how common it actually is, and saying, look, this is designed to make you feel at fault, but you're not. That is part of the reasoning behind it. It's part of the recognised impact, and it's built into a lot of the MOs to make you feel that shame. And not to let that stop you reporting the crime.
Alex, another question for you. You know, when you've said in the past that the reason for essentially leaving that world behind you was the witness statement, or the impact statement from one of your victims. What was the language like in that statement? Did that impact anything that you might have thought, or were you just kind of...
Yeah, I mean, the language of that statement changed my life. I mean, it was completely devastating. Also changed the life of my family who were in court and heard it. And, I don't think it's possible for anybody who heard that particular statement to not be profoundly moved by it. It wasn't written in deliberately moving language. It was just written in plain language, just honestly setting out how, this particular victim was director of a company, went to work as normal one day, had a nice chat with his staff, went and sat at his desk and received a phone call. And it was me. And during, I think, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, due to the order of the language I expressed on the phone, he sent me every penny that was in their account, thinking he was doing some test payments with the bank, for example. I think that was £1.3 million in a very short space of time. And he just plainly expressed in very basic terms how, he couldn't afford to pay staff at payday because he had 40 staff, couldn't pay them. I think the payroll run came to, most of £1 million. So it was a huge issue. And he expressed how he suffered a stroke and then literally the day after suffered a stroke and became profoundly ill. And then in the 6 months between him having the stroke and me being sentenced, he expressed that he had become dependent on alcohol and developed severe depression. So just this very, when I contrast the language he used, this very basic, plain, ordinary language compared to the psychological devices I was using, the contrast between the two was particularly moving. I haven't really given this any consideration, how it was written by this normal dude who'd had this horrendous thing happen to him. And it was absolutely game changing. I remember another victim I spoke to who didn't ever write an impact statement. I was never apprehended for this offence. But I think this was about £500,000 loss in a couple of hours. And I'd been speaking to this woman who was, I think, my mum's age. And during the call, she said something, I think she said, she used to keep calling me dear. She used to say, "Oh, thank you, dear. Okay, dear, I'll do this. I'll log in to my account. I'll do these test payments, dear. That's fine." And the way she said dear reminded me of my mum, and she sounded very, very similar to my mother, and would call me dear. And at the end of the phone call, she thanked me for helping her after I'd taken all of their money. That reminding me of my mum. This came about a week before we got arrested, but that made me very, begin to really think about the fact that could have been my mum on the phone. Some arsehole somewhere could be doing this to my mum. Somebody could be calling up my mum or my nan or my aunt or my loved ones and defrauding them in this way. And it made me realise how indiscriminate what we were doing really was. We didn't care that we were calling people's mums or wives or, loved ones.
Yeah, so it's almost like the language used by your victims was kind of the undoing of.
Yeah, that triggered that. So the mum thing triggered me, and then the victim impact statement destroyed me, and it was just, and that really is the only reason I decided to come away from it. Had it not been for that statement, I'd have probably still been doing it now.
And I think that's really interesting because we always think about the language that fraudsters use, but we don't think about the language that the victims use, whether it's during the crime itself or after the fact. We just don't focus on the victims in that respect. We always focus on what the fraudster did as opposed to what the victim said.
Yeah, I have to say I'm partly to blame for that, because in one way, because when I came to this, it must be more than 10 years ago now, all I could find in terms of fraud studies were psychological studies about what it is that the victims are doing that make themselves so susceptible.
Right.
What are they doing wrong, basically? And I thought, absolutely not. And I started a 10-year one-woman campaign to ignore what happens in the fraud in terms of anyone else but the perpetrator. But you're absolutely right. We do need to start looking at the victim's language as well, but from a perspective of what are they saying that could potentially have an impact on the criminals. So that could be part of protection messaging. Try saying these kinds of things or these kind of phrases. But also the kinds of language in victim impact statements. We need to try and prevent fraud as well as protect the public from these bad actors. But actually, to try and prevent these people from doing criminal acts, that's a really massive thing. And I wanted to ask Alex, actually, because when you were saying about that, I was thinking, wow, that's really interesting. There's in criminology, there's a term called techniques of neutralization. And this was, I'll show my geek side now. It came about by two academics called Sykes and Matzer back in 1957, quite a long time ago. Many papers since that have used it. But this is where the criminals use techniques or different crutches so they don't feel like they're doing anything wrong, or they justify their criminality. It sounds like the types of crimes that you committed just didn't think at all about the psychological harm, and it was purely a transactional type of thing. So then when you were face to face with the psychological harm, you were like, I can't justify this anymore. Does that sound like what happened?
Yeah, absolutely, Liz. You're spot on, as usual. So we would, I don't know about my co-defendant. In fact, I don't apply this to him. He thought in a completely different way to me. His acts were, he was in complete denial, but he was also motivated through religious ideology. So he came to the UK and illegally in a lorry with the only intention to commit fraud against the UK economy. In my case, I can't sit here with a straight face and tell you that I didn't think anybody was being harmed. But I was absolutely convinced that when these victims called the bank and said, look, I've paid all this money to you, what I thought was the bank's phone number appeared on my screen. So if we think back to reimbursement, the reimbursement model in sort of 2018, 2019, there was a ruling, I think, by the payment services regulator that said if the victim is genuinely and without being negligent, but genuinely believed it was the bank, then they're going to be entitled to have a refund. And one of the things which was most powerful in convincing the bank to refund back then was spoofing the phone number. So if the banks, and there was the argument in the courts and in Parliament at the time that the banks need to be doing more to prevent their numbers being spoofed, right? So people were getting refunds. But what I genuinely didn't realise, was how long it would take a company to get a refund. Mm-hmm. So in the case of this guy that had the stroke, so he logged into his account, he was shocked to see all the money had gone. He realised I hadn't been calling from the bank, didn't know what the hell to do, suffered a stroke. He eventually got reimbursed by the bank, but after 6 months of litigation, during which time he had no access to that cash flow. He didn't receive a sort of bridging overdraft or anything. He had no access to that money. So the company still collapsed, even though he got his £1.3 million back from the bank. But I hadn't taken that into account at all. I think fraudsters in general are in a state of denial. And you always hear, Liz and Claire, that particularly amongst criminals, fraud being described as victimless. As a victimless crime. And the reason we would say that it's victimless is because you're not stabbing somebody to death. Nobody's lying in the street bleeding. No one's been raped. No one's been killed. No one's been put in hospital. Well, this guy did, of course. But you're not committing this horrendously visible damage. And so because of that, fraudsters are almost in denial, but will tell themselves the bank will just reimburse the victims. Therefore, it's the banks we're hitting. Banks can afford it. Everyone hates banks, right? So, and there's that sort of ridiculous justification of financial crime by saying it's harmless.
Yeah, that really makes sense. But then when you're face to face with that psychological harm and the impact, and the rules that came in last October make reimbursement very quick, which is brilliant. But I'm now wondering whether that reimbursement plays into the hands of these criminals who are using it to justify their crimes, going, well, they're going to get it back within 5 days. I'm a big celebrator of the reimbursement that we have now, because it stops that re-victimisation of, well, we don't believe you, or you were negligent for the victim. But now hearing you, Alex, I was starting to think, oh my goodness, so is this going to be used as a crutch for criminals, saying, well, they get it back within 5 days?
Yeah, it is. There was a guy I was in prison with, actually, called Tony Colston Hayter, who was a prolific fraudster. He was famous, I think, in the 80s and 90s. He once handcuffed himself to Jonathan Ross. If you remember this on the Jonathan Ross show, he used to organise acid house raves and things. Oh my goodness. And he was successful at that, but he went into fraud, and I was at Wandsworth prison with him. But he used to phone up victims after defrauding them, straight away after defrauding them, say, listen, we've just stolen all that money. I'm the person you were talking to. I wasn't calling from the bank. I wasn't from the police. We've just hit you. This is what you need to say to the bank to get refunded. I don't want you to lose your money. Here is what to say to the bank to get refunded. We're now starting to see pacts being made between different organised crime networks. So it might be a Class A drug dealer speaking to a fraud OCN, organised crime network, and they'll say, listen, this company director, he buys a couple of grams of coke on a Friday night down the pub. He's got a big company. He's in charge of the books. Let's hold him over a barrel. And they'll contact the director, say, listen, we're going to tell your colleagues that you're taking coke every week. We're going to tell your family. We're going to tell you, everyone all your customers and everything. Or let's stage an APP fraud together. So they say that the fraud department the fraud team will contact you. We'll tell you everything you need to do to transfer the money to this mule account. We'll keep the money safe. It'll be in the equivalent of like a criminal escrow account. We'll tell you what to say to the bank to get refunded. Once you get refunded, we just split the money 50-50, and you get an extra. So say you move 100k into a mule account, we'll split the money 50k each. No one will hear anything more about your drugs. So anyway, what we're seeing is staged APPs, and the victims are being coached as to what to say to the bank. So the banks are now in a terrible position where they might have a director on the phone in tears saying he's been defrauded, knowing that this sort of fraud is happening where there's staged APP fraud now, and it's relying on the reimbursement model. but they don't want to run the risk of outing the person on the phone. They don't want to run the risk of victim blaming at what would be a terrible point in somebody's life. And the fraudsters know this, so they're abusing that trust, they're abusing that goodwill of the banks to stage APP, and that's the latest threat vector that's starting to really become sort of prominent, is dishonest APP. I don't know how anybody could possibly detect a staged APP or have the have the willingness to accuse somebody they suspect of doing it, at the point that they think they could also be a victim. It would take a very brave bank to make that call, and I think they'd run the risk.
Yeah, that's fascinating, terrifying.
But if you have a fraudster calling you after you've been defrauded saying, it was me, but this is what you need to say, why would you trust them?
Well, you got no other option. The money's gone.
True. So I guess at that point it's more of a case
Absolutely
of it's worth
nothing
a try.
to lose. There's nothing to lose.
Yeah. Interesting. That sort of brings us on to hybrids. Liz, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so hybrid frauds, not really things that people talk about much. We're talking about academics or practitioners, but I would probably go so far as to say that most frauds have some level of hybrid element to them, whether it's a romance fraud that has some investment element, or even another type of crime, sextortion element, to it as well. Hybrids are really important to know about because it's not just one MO, one modus operandi. We're talking about multiple different types here. And to protect yourself, it's really important to know that it might not look like one thing. It could look like several different things. So we're back to the case study approach really here, which silos frauds into this is this type of fraud, that's that type of fraud, and even other types of criminality like sextortion are never really mentioned. So much so that of all of my romance fraud data that I have, and data is the interactions, WhatsApps, telephone calls, all those that I transcribe and analyse, a fair proportion of them involve some element of sextortion. In terms of the exchange, or the victim feels it's an exchange of intimate images, but actually is the victim giving intimate images and the perpetrator sending intimate images they've taken from the last victim in return. And what happens is the perpetrator of romance fraud holds on to those and weaponizes the normal interaction, romantic interactions that in many cases become intimate. It's just online, so it's online intimacy. Yeah. And then when the romance is exposed as a crime, they can then say, yeah, I'm a criminal, but now I've got 20 of your photos and 2 of your videos, and now you're going to pay up, or everyone's going to know what's happened. Compounding that with the shame of being a victim of romance fraud, which shouldn't be there, but is there, then to have that additional threat of having your most intimate moments being broadcast to your friends and family in the world, and then extort more money. But most of the cases that are romance fraud enabled sextortion, term I came up with, most of those cases the victims didn't realise that they're actually a victim of 2 crimes here, and haven't reported the latter. So that's one reason we need to be aware of hybrid frauds, because reporting needs to accurately reflect what's happened. We can get accurate numbers, but also for protection mechanisms. So a person who is in some kind of interactional relationship that's long-term or short-term, to also be aware of other things that might be going on. So one part of the interaction might not be worrisome, another part might be worrisome, but they might both be fraudulent. So it's not just one thing.
Alex, any thoughts on that?
It's really interesting. One thing I'd say is that often fraud or so somebody's apprehended, having made a false representation might be the index offence. But the consequences, the sort of the other consequences of that offence don't get prosecuted. I'm thinking of, for example, of people who commit a fraud and then the person goes on to commit suicide, or the person commits a fraud and then, in my case, the guy has a stroke, and maybe the police would look at that and think, well, we can't actually nail the stroke on Alex. Maybe he had poor health, maybe he had other stress in his life, but to me it's clear. I think to a jury it ought to be clear that had he not been defrauded that day of £1 million, he wouldn't have had a stroke. I think when there are consequential like in civil fraud, we talk about consequential damages. When there are criminal consequential damages, like somebody committing suicide, somebody having a stroke, I mean, I think then that there should be other, alternative charges in addition to the false representation, maybe ABH or GBH, these sorts of offences, rather than focusing on the false representation itself, because the Fraud Act 2006 doesn't give any real deterrent to a fraudster. So inside out, Liz, but category 1 in that sentencing regime, to be in category 1 is £500,000 loss. So that isn't a lot these days. In 2006, that was a huge amount of fraud. But now, whether you steal 500,000 or 500 million, the maximum sentence is 10 years in custody. You plead guilty, you get a third off. You're looking at 6.5. If it's a first offence, maybe less. You're going to do half of that, so 2 years, 3 years max. As a white-collar offender, that's all going to be in Category D. That's going to be an open prison. So you're going home every weekend. You've got 1 week a month at home. Every day you're working in the community. That's not a deterrent. It's not like a drug sentence where you might get 25, 30 years.
Yeah.
It's a very, very light touch, and it's no deterrent. And I think by possibly looking at the wider consequences and marrying up, some of the damages that flow from the false representation, I think we might have a better chance of starting to deter people through sentencing policy.
That's massive, Alex. That's absolutely huge. And all of those techniques of neutralisation, they can get their money back, and all of those kind of things that go through criminals' minds to increase the risk of greater incarceration or punishment, but then also to be punished for the additional harms that, were unintended consequences, but clear consequences of that crime. To be held to account for those as well would be incredibly powerful and would drive home the fact this is not just about money. It might be for them, but it's not just about money. And those consequences of that crime that you would be held to account would be a massive deterrent, I think, psychologically. And also, conceptually as well. Yeah,
I think just as in the same way, somebody who goes and has 10 pints of beer to drink and a few lines of cocaine gets in a car and kills somebody.
Yeah,
they're not just prosecuted for driving under the influence; they're prosecuted for manslaughter as well. And I think that's exactly how the government should possibly think about, amending sentencing policy. We're in a time where nothing like that's going to be very popular because prisons are full and everyone's doing everything they can to reduce sentencing. But I think really we need to take a slightly wider view.
And the harm of fraud is not small. This is a really wide-reaching harm we've got here, physical, also psychological harm that can last decades or forever. So I think it should be brought right up to date with other crimes that cause harm as well in that way.
Yeah, and I think that there's something else to be said about to what extent the language that's written down is a successful deterrent or not, because equally it's going to stop some people or it's going to discourage some people if they see that this new sort of additions or amendments to policy have been made, that there will obviously be some who think I probably shouldn't go near that, but it isn't going to stop everyone. But I think the extent to which it can be effective in actually discouraging fraudsters or other criminals is something that's potentially worth looking into.
Yeah, and also society will start to understand that this is a really serious criminal offence, that it's not just about someone who they think has given their money away. This is someone who's being psychologically damaged in order for their money to be extracted from them unwillingly. Yeah. So that would go some way as well for sentencing, but also understandings like this is what happens. These are the harms of this. Because at present it's not really understood.
No. Well, that is all we have time for. I could go on all day, but that is all we have time for. So a huge thank you, of course, to Alex and to Liz for discussing fraud and language with me. And thank you very much, guys. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.